Welcome back to the Spoon Sports Podcast, a podcast examining current topics and issues in sports by exploring their history. College football week 7, a lot has changed since the last episode. Some events happened in week 6, but in this episode I'll cover mostly week 7. It all started on Friday night, Stanford versus Colorado. Colorado was up 29-0 at halftime. A 29-point lead, and Stanford still came back and won the game in overtime. Deion Sanders and Colorado have been on a major skid. You wonder if they will be able to survive for the rest of the year in the Pac-12. Georgia looked good, but not great versus Vanderbilt. They won 37-20, but the biggest concern for Georgia is Brock Bowers. He suffered a high ankle sprain in that game against Vanderbilt, and he will likely be out for 4 to 6 weeks. The second half of the season for Georgia is much more difficult than the first half. You wonder if they'll be able to go undefeated. Michigan and Ohio State both won convincingly against middling Big Ten teams, but by far the highlight of the week was Washington and Oregon. Both of those quarterbacks seem to be squarely in the race for the Heisman Trophy, and it was a great game. Washington won 36-33. Another game on Saturday was USC versus Notre Dame. Is Caleb Williams out of the Heisman race? Is USC squarely out of the playoff? A lot of questions arise after that questionable showing by USC, and frankly, I don't find it very surprising that the first game they play against a non-Pac-12 defense, that USC offense looks very questionable. The 7:30 game on Saturday was Miami versus North Carolina. After that debacle that was the end of the Georgia Tech game for Miami, North Carolina won 41-31, and you wonder if that Miami team is just checked out for the rest of the year and if they're going to have any chance at the ACC. Louisville. What do you know? In the last episode, I talked about Louisville. If they beat Notre Dame, they would have a serious chance at the ACC. They were undefeated, 6-0. And next week, they go and lose to Pittsburgh, who has looked terrible. Pitt won 38-21. That is a convincing win against the Louisville team, who was supposed to be a real contender for the ACC. Not anymore. Texas A&M versus Tennessee. That seat is getting warmer and warmer for Jimbo Fisher. Could be pretty close to getting hot. Texas A&M loses to Tennessee 20-13. Florida and South Carolina. Florida overcame a 10-point deficit in the final quarter, and they win 41-39. Some of next week's games. It's a pretty good week. FSU versus Duke. That's number 4 against number 16. Ohio State versus Penn State. That will be both of those teams' first big test and can go a long way in determining who has a chance at the Big Ten and the college football playoff. Tennessee takes on Alabama in Tuscaloosa. Alabama looks to get revenge from their loss last season. Utah, still without Cam Rising. Everyone wondered whether he would play in September and the start of October, but he has still not touched the field. They take on USC. Can USC bounce back from that loss last week? And finally, in the ACC, Clemson takes on Miami in Miami. Both of those teams still have a chance, I think, technically at the ACC, but especially for Miami. Have they checked out for the rest of the year? Can they win a couple more games? That game could go a long way for both of those teams, determining how the rest of their season will go. On to the MLB playoffs. Where we stand right now, the Rangers are up 2-0 versus the Astros in the ALCS, and the Phillies took game 1 versus the Diamondbacks. They're up 1-0 in the NLCS. Looking back on the rest of this postseason, it has been a crazy one. Historically crazy, even for baseball. No team with more than 90 wins was alive after the division series. That's the first time that has ever happened. Every wildcard series, Diamondbacks, Brewers, Phillies, Marlins, Rangers, Rays, and Twins, Blue Jays were all sweeps. Each of those series were won by a team 2-0. The Orioles and Dodgers were swept in the division series. The Braves lost to the Phillies. They were supposed to be the powerhouse of the whole league, and they lose in the divisional round. This brought up a lot of questions about the playoff format. Should things be changed? Should the division series be 7 games? Should more advantages be given to teams with better records, like the Braves and the Orioles, both of the number 1 seeds, out after the division series? On to week 5 in the NFL. The Chiefs beat the Broncos. That is now 16 straight wins over the Broncos, going all the way back to 2015. Some other highlight games, 2 5-0 teams lost. The 49ers lost to the Browns 19-17, and the Eagles lost to the Jets 20-14. Jalen Hurts, 3 picks in that game. As for the NBA, the preseason has started. That's about all we know right now, and we will continue to cover it as that season progresses. That concludes the current events slate. This week, I will be discussing issues related to the black athlete with an expert in this field, Dr. David Wiggins. He is the Professor Emeritus of Sports Studies at George Mason University, and Dr. Wiggins has published many scholarly articles, book chapters, and books. Among his publications are Glory Bound, Black Athletes in White America, Sport and the Color Line, Black Athletes and Race Relations in 20th Century America, and Separate Games, African American Sport Behind the Walls of Segregation. His latest book, Black Mercuries, African American Athletes, Race, and the Modern Olympic Games, was published in January 2023. Now, I hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. David Wiggins. All right, now I have with me Professor David Wiggins. Dave, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here.
You've been publishing books and articles about the Black athlete since the 1970s, and obviously there are many issues we can address. But first, can you talk a little bit about how you became interested in researching this topic and what were some of your early projects?
In 1971, the summer of 1971, I played baseball for a well-known college team in Fairbanks, Alaska, called the Alaska Gold Panthers. And the coach of that team was a man by the name of Jim Dietz, who had just accepted the head baseball job at San Diego State University. At the time, I was a student at Oregon State University, but Jim had just accepted the head baseball job at San Diego State. So I decided in the summer, actually in the fall of 1971, to transfer from Oregon State to San Diego State. I only transferred because of one thing, and that was him. I really loved him as a coach, and I only transferred because I was thinking of my baseball career more than anything else. But as it turned out, it was really a serendipitous event for me, because what happened is I arrived at San Diego State University and had access to a number of courses and a number of professors that had a particular interest in what I've always referred to as sports studies. So I ended up taking my first courses in things like sport sociology, sport history, the philosophy of sport, those types of things. Among those courses, there was one in particular that was really impactful to me, and that was a course in the sociology of sport taught by Lyle Olson, whose name may not be familiar to you, but he, longtime professor at San Diego State University, who actually founded the Sport Literature Association. But in that course from Lyle, he talked a whole lot about race and sport. In fact, talked about the fact that you really cannot understand American sport without understanding the contributions made by African Americans in sport. And I became enthralled. In fact, I looking back, I think almost immediately I realized my fascination with the topic. That this is really something I want to do. It'd be nice if I could further my academic career. And I thought immediately, my gosh, it would be really an impactful thing for me to do to study African Americans in sport. And you've got to remember too, this is during a period of time where Black studies were increasingly being implemented in university colleges across the country. There was really an interest in the life and culture and history of African Americans more generally. And this is really immediately after the famous Black protest of Tommy Smith and John Carlos in Mexico City at the 1968 Olympic Games. And so there was just this real interest in African life and history more generally, but there's really this interest in Black athletes. And again, I became enthralled with it. And after taking my master's degree, I went to the University of Maryland for my PhD, and I focused on studying African Americans. My first research projects, my dissertation at the University of Maryland, interestingly enough, I think people are usually surprised by this, dealt with slavery in antebellum America. The dissertation dealt with, more specifically, the recreational activities, leisure time activities of slaves living on southern plantations in the early 19th century. Has as horrendous and awful as the institution was. Slaves were no different than anybody else, and that one of their survival mechanisms was play. One of their survival mechanisms was implementing games among themselves and participating in recreational pursuits. So those were really my first studies. In fact, my first article I ever published was in 1977 in the Journal of Sport History, and it dealt with that topic, the play, leisure, and recreational pursuits of slaves living on southern plantations.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those, I guess, courses that you took back in your time at your university. I can only imagine how different some of those courses surrounding those topics must be nowadays. Other modern viewers might find it difficult to imagine a world in which Black athletes are not featured prominently in big-time sports, but it was a long, hard road for them to get to where they are today. Can you tell us about the early years of Black participation in sports? You mentioned some of it, just the philosophy of it with during slavery, and how they started to break into the white-dominated sports structure.
Yeah, I think the first two really important African-American athletes, at least in my view, are two athletes by the name of Tom Molyneux and Bill Richmond. The sources are a bit limited, but we believe that both Tom Molyneux and Bill Richmond were slaves who won their plantation owners large amounts of money through boxing that the planters organized, and were ultimately granted their freedom. The sources are limited, but that's what we believe. We do know, and we have a great deal more information about this. We do know that somehow Bill Richmond first found his way. He traveled across the Atlantic and went to London and set up a boxing school, set up the Dolphin Inn where he taught boxing and also competed himself as a pugilist. Shortly thereafter, Tom Molyneux made the same trek, traveled across the Atlantic, and met up with Bill Richmond. Richmond tutored him. And what happens is Tom Molyneux ends up fighting twice, both in 1810 and 1811, for the heavyweight championship of the world against a famous English boxer by the name of Tom Cribb. So for me, it's Molyneux and Richmond who are really the first two important African-American athletes that we know of. Interestingly, what happens in the post-Civil War period is we'll see a select number of great African-American athletes who will distinguish themselves in predominantly white organized sport in the post-Civil War period. One of those would be Isaac Murphy, a great jockey from Lexington, Kentucky. As you may know, the large majority of the first jockeys were African American. Isaac Murphy was one of those. He captured the Kentucky Derby 3 times, once back to back, and garnered many other titles. He was one of those African American athletes in the post-Civil War period that distinguished himself. Marshall Major Taylor, the great black bicyclist from Indianapolis, Indiana. There was this Moses Fleetwood Walker, who became the first African American to play Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson, as most folks know, was the first to play modern Major League Baseball, but Moses Fleetwood Walker was actually the first. Jimmy Winkfield, another great African-American jockey, was competing in the latter stages of the 19th century. We will have again a select number of great Black athletes who will not just distinguish themselves, but in some cases dominate sport. Unfortunately, what happens in the last decade of the 19th century, and increasingly throughout the first, Black athletes will be segregated from white sport, just like Blacks were segregated from American culture, as a result of the passage of the Black Codes, or a number of Supreme Court decisions would essentially segregate people based on race. And so the same thing that happened to African Americans more generally would happen to Black athletes. And so what happens is, when that happens, what we will see is the creation of really separate sports institutions, the creation of Black teams, Black leagues, Black organizations, really the creation of a separate Black sporting culture that will extend, again, the last decade of the 19th century throughout much of the first half of the 20th century. The most famous of these separate Black teams and leagues would be Negro League Baseball, but there are separate sports organizations that will be established in, my gosh, virtually every sport. Separate Black organizations, sporting organizations in golf, in tennis, in bowling, in football. They were extraordinarily important organizations for members of the African American community. So, yeah, I could go on and on, but maybe I should just stop right there.
Yeah, that was great to hear. One of the topics that has drawn a lot of attention in recent years is the Black athlete and activism. Some agree with the sentiment of TV host Laura Ingraham, who notoriously told LeBron James to shut up and dribble. Others believe athletes have as much right to voice their opinions as anyone else. Can you talk about the background and origins of Black athletes and their activism?
I think the first, we'll see evidences of Black activism in sport, certainly in the mid 20th century. But I think the most important period for initial period for Black athletic activism would be in the 1960s, as a result of the civil rights movement, as a result of the Black Power movement. We will have African American athletes who end up expressing their views publicly, African American athletes who decide to become involved in the civil rights struggle, and will begin to speak out about the racial inequities, not just the racial inequities in sport, but the racial inequities in American culture more generally. The athletes that I'm thinking about are athletes like Bill Russell, the great basketball player from West Oakland, who led the University of San Francisco to back-to-back NCAA basketball titles and went on to lead the Boston Celtics to multiple NBA championships. Bill Russell, through his publications, through his writings, but also verbally, would certainly become involved as an activist in the 1960s. Another of those athletes of that type would be Jimmy Brown, the great, All-American lacrosse player and All-American football player from Syracuse University, and 9-year NFL player with the Cleveland Browns, who, when he retired, would be the leading rusher in NFL history. Jimmy Brown was another one of those athletes in the 1960s who spoke out vehemently about the racial inequality in American culture. And then third, last but certainly not least, the athlete, one of those athletes I'm thinking of is Muhammad Ali. Cassius Clay by name at birth, but shortly after capturing the World Heavyweight Championship from Sonny Liston in Miami of 1964, announced that he had become a member of the Black Muslims and was now a follower of Elijah Muhammad and a good friend with the most visible of all the Black Muslims, Malcolm X. But Muhammad Ali was he was the most important of all the African-American athletes in the 1960s who vehemently spoke out about the lack of racial equality for African Americans in sport and, again, the larger American culture. He became a divisive figure. There's certainly a large segment of white America that detested Ali. But for many folks, and certainly for many folks of my generation, black and white, Muhammad Ali really became our hero. He was somebody who had the courage to certainly speak out, not just about racial inequality, but had the courage to speak out about the Vietnam War. Many of us were adamantly opposed to it, and of our generation, and he became, in many ways, our spokesman against the participation in the conflict of Vietnam. So those are really, really important figures. So when I think of black athletic activism, I always look back at the 1960s. Was there another part of that question, Andrew? I can't remember.
I think you pretty much nailed it. One other thing that I did want to ask about was how have things changed for athletes like LeBron, since those early protests in the 1960s?
I think it depends partly on sport. I think it's extraordinarily difficult in this day and age, like it was in the 1960s, to be an athlete and to speak out on larger issues. I still think in American culture, there's this notion that African American athletes should hone their talents and work as hard as they possibly can to be successful on sport, but it's none of their business to speak out on larger issues. I still think that holds true, just like it did in the 1960s. But I'm not so sure. In some ways, maybe it's strength in numbers is helpful to the black athletes today, and I think for the black athletes in the sport of basketball, I think they certainly have more support than those black athletes in the NFL, which tends to be largely more conservative and more closely tied to the military establishment. You still might suffer from speaking out as a basketball player, but it's nothing like what can potentially happen to a black athlete in football, particularly the NFL. The classic example of that would be what happened to Colin Kaepernick in 2016 for making his silent gesture for deciding to kneel during the playing of the national anthem prior to the NFL games. Colin Kaepernick, it was just an attempt to make more visible the police brutality that was taking place in American culture. It was his way to try to make more visible the many deaths that were taking place among young black men in this country. He suffered immensely. In fact, he essentially lost out on his NFL career. he was blackballed from the NFL, has never played again. So it's still a risk, certainly, and particularly in football. I think even far more than it is basketball. But there's obviously a difference of opinion. There are some folks that believe athletes just shouldn't be involved in larger racial and political and social kinds of issues.
Yeah, one of the modern leagues that has done a lot when it comes to athletic protest is the WNBA. Why do you think the Women's Basketball League has been at the forefront of those protests, and can you talk about a few examples of them?
Oh, I think, it's interesting. I think that when you think of activism, when you think about the history of African Americans more generally, and who took leadership roles, who was involved in trying to make things better, who was out in front in trying to erase discriminatory practices and to increase equality. And I must say that African American women have always been integral parts of that movement. They've always been at the forefront of efforts to make things better in this country from a racial standpoint, from the beginning of our history. As far as the WNBA players, the WNBA is made up, as you know, to a great extent of African American women, but it's also a league made up. There's a lot of lesbian players in the WNBA, and these are individuals who have been fighting for recognition and respect their entire lives. So I think for them to fight for recognition and respect is really, in essence, nothing new. They've had to fight and scratch and do everything possible their entire lives. So it's really not a novel kind of experience for any of them. There's a number of examples of this. She's not a lesbian player, but I think the prime example of activism, perhaps the single best example of activism for a player in the WNBA was Maya Moore, who was an All-American at the University of Connecticut. One of the great college and professional players of all time. Would probably serve as a prime example. She set out both the 2019 and 2020 seasons in an effort to fight for the freedom of a man by the name of Jonathan Irons. Actually set out 2 complete WNBA seasons to fight to see that he was released from prison. And I think that's quite remarkable. Interestingly enough, Maya Moore would end up actually marrying Jonathan Irons and has since retired from the game, largely to continue to take part in kind of the larger civil rights struggle, but also to take part in simple justice for all. So I think she would be a prime example of activism among a player from the WNBA.
Yeah, that league, especially in the recent years with athletes such as Brittany Griner and Maya Moore, it's been at the forefront of a lot of controversy. There was also quite a bit of controversy. Yes, there was also quite a bit of controversy last year when Brian Flores was fired as head coach of the Miami Dolphins. After 3 successful seasons and winning 10 out of 9 games in his last 2 seasons, which many people considered overachieving. He then sued the league and several of its teams for racial discrimination when it was revealed that the New York Giants had decided to hire Brian Daboll as their head coach even before interviewing Flores. That situation highlights the challenges that blacks have faced in earning positions in coaching and management. Can you talk about the history of these issues and who were some of the first black coaches or managers?
It's certainly not a good history. It's been a continual fight for African Americans to find their way into coaching and managerial positions in virtually every sport at whatever level of competition you're talking about. Fritz Pollard, the great running back from Brown University out of Providence, Rhode Island, was the great black running back from Brown University, was certainly an early coach, and there are several others names that I can provide, but it's been really a struggle. I mean, it wouldn't be until 1966 that we would see a black coach in the NBA, and in that year, Bill Russell, to mention him again, Bill Russell became player coach of the Boston Celtics. It would not be until 1975 that we see the first black manager in Major League Baseball, and that would take place when Frank Robinson, the great outfielder, would sign to be manager of the Cleveland Indians. So it's been a slow and painful process to see blacks assume coaching, managerial, and other leadership positions and again, at all levels of sport, college, and professional levels of competition. I hate to say it, but there's this deep-seated stereotypical notions about, and always has been, can black athletes be the leader of other men and women? Do they have the characteristics that it takes to be successful in these kinds of leadership positions? And it's still a struggle. I would contend, I think the facts bear out that even if you're a black coach or manager, you probably have a much shorter leash as a coach or manager. You're not given as much time to realize success. And so it's really one of the continuing struggles in sport. And I think it's largely a result of the deep-seated stereotypical notions that we have about the ability levels of people based on race. And hopefully that situation will progress and improve.
Yeah, another form of leadership from an athletic standpoint would be ownership. In recent years, we've seen Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, and others enter the ranks of ownership. Now, neither Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan are still owners, but they were definitely some highlights in recent years. Are there previous examples of black owners, and what was their experience like?
I think one of the best examples would be what happened in 2002. Robert Johnson, who was founder of the Black Entertainment Network, became principal owner of the Charlotte Hornets of the NBA. I can't remember exactly what he spent to purchase that organization, but Robert Johnson was one of, if not the first, really principal owner of any professional sports franchise that I know of. But more recently, there's been some positive sorts of developments along those lines. I think when you see the involvement of Michael Jordan as part of ownership teams, that's a positive. Certainly the involvement, certainly what Magic Johnson has been able to do and becoming a member of groups buying into professional sports franchises. Venus Williams and Serena Williams,
Hmm.
I know, have also been involved in some ownership with the Miami Dolphins, for example. So there is some examples, some isolated incidents uh, where we've seen African Americans be able to become owners of, or at least part owners of professional sports franchises. So I hope we can see some continuing improvement along those lines as well.
Well, we've covered a lot of topics about modern sports. I wanted to give you some time to talk about your recent book, Black Mercuries, which you wrote with Professor Mark Dyerson and Kevin Witherspoon. There's a lot of ground to cover there, but are there two or three topics that stand out to you after writing the book?
Oh, there's many. I think when Mark and Kevin and I were writing this book, I was really reminded of the uh, importance, for example, the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. Um, that to me, still to this day, the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin is extraordinarily important from a racial and political standpoint. Um, and I was reminded once again about the serious debate that took place in American culture as to whether we should even send our athletes to Berlin in 1936. There were many people arguing that we shouldn't because of the atrocities that were taking place in Germany at the time and because of the rise of the Nazis. But that game reminded me once again of just the enormous, racial implications. Because you had the Nazis talking about this notion of Aryan racial superiority, but yet here in America, we're having our own problems with racial discrimination in American culture, and how ironic it was, really, that that many of those athletes that went to Berlin and did so well and triumphed in Olympic competition were those very same people that, when they came back home to the United States, didn't have equal access to facilities and would still experience abhorrent incidents of racial discrimination. So 1936 in Berlin is, I think, an extremely important event. And of course, the most famous of those African American athletes would be Jesse Owens, who garnered 4 gold medals in Berlin. But I was also reminded in putting together the book how important the 1968 Olympic Games were in Mexico City, and from when you think about the African American athlete and race more generally, how important the Black protest of Tommy Smith and John Carlos were that took place in 1968 in Mexico City. The raising of their black glove fist high into the air in protest on the victory stand following their first and third place finishes in the 200-meter dash. That was an extraordinarily important event. Harry Edwards, really the mastermind behind the whole protest movement in Mexico City, always argued that one of the great ways to capture the attention of the American public was to disrupt in some way the sacred institution of sport. And Tommy Smith and John Carlos, with their black glove salutes, certainly did that. They certainly made visible this notion of and with their brave and powerful salute on the victory stand. And I guess for me, maybe a third event. I look back and I think about 1984 in Los Angeles. I happen to think the 84 games in LA were extraordinarily important. Just the way the games were organized, but certainly the great performances of athletes from the United States in '84 were remarkable, and certainly the great performances of African Americans in LA in 1984 were remarkable, particularly the performance of Carl Lewis. Carl Lewis duplicated Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals from 1936. He also garnered 4 gold medals in the same events that Jesse had garnered in 1936 in Berlin. So I think his performances were great. And that was, for Carl Lewis, for heaven's sakes, that was one of some of the things of, has anybody ever had a better Olympic career, maybe other than Michael Phelps, a better Olympic career than Carl Lewis. I also think about fondly, I look back at the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles because that's the year that Rayford Johnson, the great UCLA star, the great decathlon champion, lit the Olympic flame in Los Angeles in 1984. That, for me, was one of the more memorable torch lightings in history. Maybe other than the torch lighting in 1996 in Atlanta when it was lit by the great Muhammad Ali. But 1936, 68, and 84 really stand out for me in regards to the Summer Olympic Games.
So you mentioned some of the more well-known Olympic athletes. Do you know a couple maybe more obscure or lesser-known athletes that are representative of some of the issues that they faced?
I think one of the lesser-known athletes that I think needs to be remembered by people would be, and this is somebody that I've written about, but would be Milt Campbell, who was a great high school star out of New Jersey. Milt Campbell was one of the great athletes in Olympic history that gets lost somehow amidst all the other great athletes. Milt Campbell captured the silver medal in the decathlon in 1952 in Helsinki. He lost to Bob Mathias, but then came back in 1956, won the gold medal in the decathlon by defeating Rayford Johnson in Melbourne, Australia. But he's been he's one of those athletes that has been largely forgotten. Everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but Olympic experts and aficionados and sports fans, I think most of us remember the great Bob Mathias out of Tulare, California, who won 2 gold medals in the decathlon. And I think people tend to remember Bill Toomey, another great decathlon champion. Most folks remember Bruce Jenner, another great decathlon champion. But Milt Campbell tends to be forgotten in that context. So he's somebody I think people need to know about and need to remember. He's just one of those people that has been forgotten for whatever reason. So he's one of those African American athletes that I always think of. I dare say, when I think about 1936, Jesse Owens received the bulk of the attention. I mean, his name resonates with those folks in the United States and around the world. He's one of the great names in Olympic history. But we forget there were many, many other great African American athletes that competed in 1936 in Berlin that we've largely forgotten. Most of those were teammates of Jesse Owens on the Olympic team in 1936. How many people know the name Cornelius Johnson from Compton Junior College, who was the gold medalist in the high jump? How many people remember the name David Albritton, who was the silver medalist in the high jump, who was a teammate of Jesse Owens at Ohio State? How many people would remember the name of Mac Robinson, Jackie Robinson's older brother, who had gone to the University of Oregon, and Mac Robinson captured a medal in Berlin in 1936. I mean, I could go on and on about Jesse Owens' teammates because of his enormous fame. And the fact he won 4 gold medals have really been forgotten from Olympic competition. I think I would hope that those names can be remembered by more people than they are.
Yeah. To bring it back to the present, one athlete that you have written about is Simone Biles. What do you find so significant about her story?
I think one of the things I find significant is that, African American athletes in the history of sport, African American athletes have always been present in larger numbers in some sports, and not really present in larger numbers in other sports. There's that has been a trend in American sport history. We have African American athletes that are more closely, African American athletes are really more closely identified with football and basketball, and have been able to find their way into those sports in increasing numbers. While on the other hand, African American athletes have had a very, very difficult time finding their way into, some of those sports that I refer to as country club sports. They've had a difficult time finding their way into golf and tennis, for instance, or at least on an integrated basis. And it serves true for both African American male athletes and African American female athletes. African American female athletes have been able to find their way into to basketball in pretty good numbers, but have had a far more difficult time finding their way into to other sports. I mean, tennis, golf, and gymnastics, ice skating, you name it. They've had a difficult time finding their way into those sports. But I've always been fascinated with African American athletes who have been able to find their way into the lesser known sports, or those sports they've had a more difficult time finding their way into. So I'm fascinated because Simone Biles is involved in gymnastics. For a long while, you just did not see many African American women in the sport. So I'm fascinated by the fact that she's so dominant in that particular sport. But I'm also really an admirer, quite frankly, of Simone Biles, because I think she showed extraordinary courage at the Tokyo Olympic Games by deciding she was going to take herself out of competition because of mental health issues. I think that took a great deal of courage and bravery to do that. Because she was smart enough to know that she was going to experience all sorts of criticism and pushback from that decision. So I think it was a brave and courageous thing for her, again, to take herself out of competition because of the mental health issues that she was experiencing. I think that was a very, very, very important thing for her to do. I think it was very impactful. And I've got to think that it has influenced other athletes who are also suffering from mental health issues. So for me, that was an extraordinary event in Olympic history.
Yeah, you mentioned African American athletes struggling to find their way into what you consider to be country club sports. Do you see Tiger Woods in a similar light as you do Simone Biles?
Yes, I do. I admire, and I've always admired Tiger Woods' golfing exploits. I think he has what a remarkable career he has had on the links. I think, obviously he's one of the great golfers of all time. Personally, I wish he had been more vocal about larger issues. I wish he had spoken out more vehemently about all sorts of issues in American culture, but he just has not. He has not done it. He's essentially remained neutral on many issues. I mean, that's his right to do, obviously. In fact, I'm a bit reluctant right here to criticize him too much for what he has or has not done, but I wish that he had taken what is really an enormous platform. I wish he had taken his platform and spoken out more forcibly about larger issues and matters. I wish he had taken more of the approach of a Bill Russell or a Muhammad Ali or LeBron James or a Colin Kaepernick, and had raised his voice about some serious issues that still confront all of us in America.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I mean, I guess when you have a platform like that, you begin, or maybe not in the case, but as you mentioned, you feel responsible to use it, for things you think are right.
Exactly.
Well, finally, as a historian, you focus on issues in the past. But where do you think we stand today in terms of the Black athlete in sports compared to where we have been in the past? And what issues do you see being important as we move ahead into the future over the next 5 to 10 years?
I think we have to continue to speak out about racial inequities that we know are existing in sport and larger society. I'd like to see much more attention paid to Black coaches, managers, and others in leadership positions. I still think that is a problem that continues to exist in sport. I think we have to tackle it head on and not skirt the issues, and do everything that we possibly can to see that African American athletes have an equal chance, an equal opportunity, not just to make their way on the playing field, but also have an opportunity to assume careers in coaching, managerial, and other leadership and other administrative positions in sport. That is going to continue to be a problem, I think, but I think we have to hit it head on and not skirt those issues. I would certainly like to see more opportunities for both African American male and women athletes on the playing field as well. I think, interestingly enough, I think Title IX that was passed in 1972 was far more impactful for white women athletes than it was African American women athletes. And while African American athletes have Title IX was a positive thing for African American women athletes, but they still lag behind on participation rates. Not in basketball and track and field, but African American women certainly still lack in participation rates in many sports, and so I'd like to see more of an effort paid to that fact as well. Progress has been made. but we still have a lot to do to make things better, both in sport and the larger American culture.
Well, I feel like we covered a lot of bases when it comes to the history of African sport and covering the present issues. Dave, thank you so much for.
Sure, Andrew, my pleasure, and I hope we can talk again.
Well, that's it for the second episode of the Spoon Sports Podcast. After reviewing the footage and editing the interview, I noticed there were a lot of moments where my mic sounded awful. There was a lot of fuzziness when Dave was talking or whether I was talking. So I'll probably look into getting a new mic. Hopefully that won't take too long, and I'll have it ready by the next episode. Before we end, I wanted to say some thank yous to Dave for being able to do this interview with me. I really appreciate that. And I also wanted to say another thank you to Aslan Hadjavandi, who continues to be really helpful in this whole process. Thanks for listening. I hope you listen to the next episode.